So in the second video, I'm going to talk a little bit more about typography. When you're doing logo design or really any kind of design, typography is probably the most important. I mean, I know we look at a lot of images and a lot of infographics and a lot of photos, and they certainly engage us. But typography is where you kind of separate um, the amateurs from the professionals when it comes to design. And typography does take a long time to really master, but you have to start somewhere. So kind of understanding how typography works in Illustrator, it works a lot different in a lot of different programs. Illustrator is a very good program for typography, especially when doing logo design. Probably InDesign will probably be the best when it comes to typesetting, and if you had like long documents, you certainly want to use something like InDesign. Earlier video we showed you how we just basically typed the text in. Now we had gone over some of the type tools before, doing type on a path, but I kind of want to focus a little bit more today on the character panel. So the character panel you can get by going to Window, Type, and Character, or you can just go Apple, or Command T. So in the let me blow this up a little bit. So if you have it, two letters, a couple things you can do. Obviously, you can highlight them to change, the point size. So right now it's 164 points. I can make that 184 points. Enter. This right here is called your leading. So if you have two, so let's see if I put my entire name. I'm going to make this a little smaller. So sometimes when you type in Illustrator, you see this little plus sign. It means there's more type that's going on in the box. So right now, this space in between the two words is what's called the leading. So the distance from the bottom of this font to the middle right here is the leading. So that's the space in between. So that's 192 points. So you can change that by making that smaller. Obviously, if you make it really small, it's going to jam up against each other. If you make it 72, so you can put any number you want. A good rule of thumb is to have it close to the size of your point. Then if you want to make it smaller, you can make it smaller. You can either use the arrows. I like to use shortcuts by highlighting and holding on the Option key with the arrow. Up arrow, Option, and down arrow makes your leading increase or decrease. So you can move with leading. You also have space in between each letter, so that's called kerning. So you can make that, so you can select the entire font, and then it's on auto. So you can have, it's the tracking. So let's use this one. So the tracking option, which is the one on the right. So if we add a number 23, it's going to put the space in between each letter form. Okay. And the more you do it, the more it's spaced out. Now, with a lot of logos, and you may or may not notice this, but if you look at a lot of logos, you're going to see leading tends to be a little tighter than normal. So if you just come in and type normally, you'll have this leading. Now, what you have is negative spaces in between here and here. It's not a typography class, but just so you understand that, you can close up the spacing in between these letters to make them look more interesting. Like this space is way bigger than this space. So you can click the cursor in between the letters, and then you can individually move those spaces. Say if you put minus, let me select these two. So you select the font, and then you can also hold the Option key and go the left arrow or the right arrow to increase the kerning. Notice that this one is changing. This is the tracking, and this is the kerning. Tracking tends to deal more with paragraphs of text, and kerning tends to deal more with letter forms, individual letters. So if I hit the Option key, I can move it in. I can take this space is like really wide. I can move that in. So optically, you can do it individually. You don't have to do them all the same. Optically, you want the curved letters to be closer to the straights. So any negative space, you want to close that up. So that's a much better kerned type than if I had just I'm going to copy this and show you what it looks like with, the way it was at the beginning. So that's what the type, just regular type letter forms look like in Illustrator. And then I'm going to get rid of this. And then the one on the top is actually types out a lot better. So you see how much more interesting and attractive the letter forms interact with each other. And when you just type it out, that's what, if you just type stuff out and leave it like that, I'll be able to tell. And designers will be able to tell that you just typed it out on the computer. So you want to go in and you want to play around, and it takes, it definitely takes a lot of practice, but it takes some understanding of how letter forms work. And different letter forms, if I change this font, from Myriad and I made Helvetica, it will change. I might have to go in and then readjust. It might be too close, so I may have to go in and readjust my kerning because it's just too much now. So as you change the letter forms, you have to go in and kern the letters, as needed. Now sometimes you may see, I'm going to make this much smaller. You see a lot of spaced out letters. If you're going to space letters out, and I'm going to space this out, Option and space it out, never use lowercase letters to space out. Here's another rule. With typography and characters, always, if you're going to use all caps, choose the all caps in the actual panel and don't type it out by hitting the shift or the caps lock key. Reason is that if you're typing things out and you go all caps, it's going to change. If you want to remove it, it's actually faster to take the all caps off and it goes back to normal. But if you're going to space letters out, you definitely want to use caps and not upper lowercase, right? So if you're going to space letters out, like you were going to put, Tony Julian, graphic designer, and I'm going to space that out a little bit. I'm using Option arrow keys to move letters much faster, kern them in and out. So you have this big text box, you can close it up. So sometimes, you have, I'm designing a logo, I might, have a main header or main focal point, and then I may have a secondary header on my, on my secondary type. So you can play around with different, kernings, the letter forms. You also have, you can move, set the baseline shift up, above, or you can be down. So if you want to, sometimes you have letter forms that you want to raise, like a superscript, and you might want to actually raise it above, or just play around with the typography. So never use this one, the horizontal scale. Don't ever use that. If you use that, you're actually distorting the typeface. So you don't ever want to use the vertical or the horizontal scale. If you want a typeface that's more vertical or more horizontal, use, like I have Helvetica in here. I might be able to use, find a typeface, have Helvetica New in here. I think Helvetica New Condense. So if I want a condensed typeface, I will use a condensed face. If I want an extended typeface, I'll find something that's more extended. So I know Avenir is one of the fonts I have, and it's a maybe Trade Gothic. Trade Gothic has a extended. So you see the font actually extends, and this stays the same. It's 100%. So don't ever try to skew your font to that way, because that also tells designers that you don't know how to play with typography and you don't know what you're doing. So don't ever utilize the vertical and horizontal scales. Try to find type or fonts that will have an extended or a condensed version. So one of the other things that you might want to do in Illustrator, and you only want to do this when you're completely convinced that your type has works the way you want it to work. I'll kind of go back. Is change fonts to outlines. Now the thing about typography is that if you just you can do it two different ways. So sometimes what I do is I want to play with the letter forms. I will copy this. I'll delete the second one, and this one I'll delete the first one. So what I end up having is actually two text boxes. So when I have two text boxes, I actually can manipulate the type a little bit more. So I'm not constrained to just the text box. I can move the type if I want the Y to kind of intersect a little bit with the I, and I can move around. Sometimes you want to play around with the letters, where they fall. So I have a little bit more control, and I may want to move this in here. I can move my text box down so everything fits. So when this happens, I know my leading is very, very wide. So if I select that, see my type size is 20, but my leading is 140. So that means it's way down here. So I'm going to make that about 20. It's going to come up, or maybe 30. Okay, so when you see things like that, don't panic. It's just because the leading is remembering what it was in the previous text box. So if you need to go to the second line, you can certainly use this, the return key on the leading to move things up and down. But you also might want to sometimes do two different text boxes where you have more control. So one of the things you can do in Illustrator is change text to outlines. I always, a rule of thumb, if I'm ever going to use outlines, I always copy the font and keep it to the side. Why? Because if I change this to outlines, I can't bring it back to regular text and I can't type. So if I do that, and sometimes you want to do that because if you send a file to someone and they don't have the particular font that you have, it's going to show up in a default font. So if I have Helvetica New or Avenir, but you don't have that font in your computer, it's probably going to open up in Courier or Myriad or some other font that, I'm not trying to. Imagine showing this file to a client, and the client doesn't have Illustrator. It's going to show up in the wrong font. But what I could do is go to Type and change it to Outlines. What's going to happen, it's like the first one. So what's going to happen with Outlines is that the font now becomes text. It becomes a shape, not text. It becomes a shape. So you can manipulate that shape and be very careful manipulating type. I'm showing you this not so you go crazy with it. I'm showing you there are opportunities. Sometimes you have an opportunity. I'm clicking on the endpoints. So I'm using my direct selection tool, clicking on the endpoints of the N. I'm dragging it down. So I'm actually creating sort of a font, an interesting font. And I'm clicking on the endpoints here, and I'm going to drag it up. So you can really, by changing your font, from a font to outlines, you have other really, really good opportunities to start off and just create something really interesting. And you still have this full range of color with your Pantone colors, right? Remember the requirement is to have at least 2 Pantone colors and not more than 3. Well, not more than 3. Okay, so you can start really playing around and doing some interesting things with typography and color. You also have the opportunity to put gradients inside of type, although I would not suggest that, but because it is there may be an opportunity at some point to do that. I wouldn't do that for a logo, but I'm just showing you that you can certainly play around with type. So, but if I had to come back and move the kerning around, then I would have to probably retype this. So right now my type is kind of grouped together. If I wanted to ungroup this, I would have to I can use the actual lasso tool, and I could actually drag my cursor around a particular letter form, and just the letter form highlights, and then I can click the direct selection tool and move it around separately. So even though it's selected as one object, you can still kind of play around with by using the different tools to manipulate typography. In the next video, I will go over a little bit more about paragraph text in Illustrator.